Good evening. Thank you for coming for Apologetics, the part 3 of our 3-part series, which was interrupted by a 3-part part 2. But we're going to pick up today and try to pull it all together and try to answer some tough questions. It really does help to actually have seen the rest of them and been, actually studied a little bit to know some of the things that it takes to do this, but it's not really necessary in the end, and I'll explain that when I get there. But first, let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, I just thank you for this opportunity to get together and to just hear what you have to say, and also to learn how to defend our faith, Lord. That you have called us to defend and not to back down or to cower or to run from what the culture has to say, but to confront it. And Paul and Peter gave us great examples in the New Testament. Lord, we just seek to follow them. Lord, I just pray that you would be with us tonight, that you would help us to hear what you have to say about apologetics and defending what we believe and what is right and true. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, I just want to, it's been a while since we met, actually since last August. It's February now. So I just want to remind everybody what we're intending to do with this apologetic series. That is, as it says here, the intended outcome to help equip and encourage Christians in apologetics ministry so that they might engage honest truth seekers under the right circumstances with gentleness, respect, and with the ultimate goal of introducing the gospel of Jesus. I promise not to read many of the slides, but I did want to remind everybody what we're doing here tonight, and that is we want to engage people who really are seeking the truth. But we want to remember that God told us to do it with gentleness and respect, and so that's probably the hardest thing about talking with somebody is dealing with someone and trying to be gentle and respectful. And there are definitely some great apologists out there who demonstrate this very well, and I hope I can be like that. So I want to harken back to our former days here. Back in part 1, way back a year ago, January, we actually started with what traditional apologetics deals with, and that are those things that deal with religion specifically. How do we know God exists? Is the Bible reliable? And those things. And we wanted to be able to give sound responses to those, and we talked about some different arguments that could be used in dealing with those specifically. But then we wanted to broaden that a bit, and so in part 2 we actually dug deep into logic and started talking about intelligibility and logic, and really began this discussion of how we can pick apart an argument and find out what's wrong and know that there's actually something wrong with this argument because of these tools that we were equipping ourselves with. Part 2B continued the basics of logic and really wrapped that all up and brought us all the tools we needed to do to look at arguments in a logical fashion, which led us to part 2C, which allowed us to actually construct arguments. And we looked at formal deductive logic and then went into applying logic. And I'm going to actually pick up this session by reviewing some of the applying logic. If you want to review the other parts, you'll need to go back and watch the videos. Each one of those slides had the YouTube link on there. If you want to find it on YouTube, you certainly can. Look me up, David Onder, at YouTube. Well, not David Onder, YouTube, but go to YouTube, type in David Onder. So we're going to talk about applying logic. I want to remind us that one of the things that I think sort of summarizes the whole basic approach. Jason Lyle did a great job of writing this in his book, The Ultimate Proof of Creation, and really was the focus of his book. And that is in Proverbs 26, 4 through 5. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. And remembering that there's actually, there's two parts to this verse. The first part, in verse 4, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself, is to remember that we don't want to give up our side of the argument. We have a stance, and there is no neutral ground. So we cannot cede ground to our opponent, lest we become like him and become a fool. We want to stand our ground and avoid becoming like the fool, knowing that we actually know the truth and they don't. So the second part says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. That is, we need to point out to the fool what is wrong with his argument or her argument, so that they will no longer be a fool. Right now they think they're wise, and what they're saying they think is true, but it is not, and we need to help to show them that it is not. The NASB has it a slightly different way, and I sort of like it. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will also be like him. Answer a fool as his folly deserves, that he not be wise in his own eyes. And I think that does a little bit better job of actually explaining the difference between those two verses. And I think that's really the foundation of everything that we do in apologetics. Don't cede ground to our opponent, because we don't want to be like them and be a fool, but do what we can to help them see the errors of their argument so that they are no longer fools. We looked at another way, another approach, which is basically the same idea, and it was presented by Greg Kokel in his book Tactics, which I highly recommend. It is a great book. But that is to start asking questions. And in fact, as we'll talk about later on, that's the first step in everything. Anytime we deal with apologetics, our goal is to start asking questions about it. Try to find out what they mean. What are you saying? Why do you believe this? And get a greater understanding. Greg Kokel calls this the Columbo approach. And if anyone remembers good old Columbo, the great thing about Columbo was he could start asking questions in a very disarming way. Just, I've got this itch. Something has just been nagging me, and I don't understand it. And maybe you can enlighten me. And it was just very disarming, because people were not expecting that what he was actually doing was setting them up, and had them answering questions that ultimately would cause them to realize in the end they were wrong, or that he actually knew what was going on and got the truth out of them. And so the Columbo approach is great. The other thing about the Columbo approach that's wonderful is he was never rude. Columbo was always a very gentle, very respectful person. And so if you want to have a great example of the apologetics approach, rent a video of Columbo and watch him. He is certainly a great example of someone that we could model ourselves on. So, and also in this applying the logic, we looked at a couple examples, and I'm going to look at those examples right now. I'm just going to look at a couple of them because they're relevant to our discussion tonight. The first one is just the basic applying logic, and that is you have a child who just out in front of everybody blurts out, there is no proof for God, and you are absolutely stunned and speechless at that point. What do you say to this child? They say it's simply not rational. And so what do you say? And I think what we need to do here is we need to begin by asking some questions. Going back through what what this child says, and that is, he says he doesn't believe in God anymore. So maybe we need to ask, who's God? When you say you don't believe in God, who don't you believe in? What aren't you believing in anymore? And when you say it's simply not rational, what's not rational? Try to tease out from them what is not rational about believing in God. There must be something that they're thinking in their head about that doesn't make any sense, and try to pull that out. And once you get that out in the open, then you can start dealing with that issue. And if you might find that there's actually only one thing. Like, it's so irrational to believe in God. I mean, how could he be born of a virgin? Okay, is that the only reason that you don't believe in God? Because if that's the only reason, then let's deal with it. And then we're only dealing with one, not with the grand possibilities of all these different things. There's no sense in trying to respond to somebody and try to address the irrationality of God existing if you don't actually know why they think it's irrational that God exists. We really want to address their issue and hope to help them understand. Now, the other interesting thing about this particular situation is the child found it important enough to tell you they don't believe in God. So something about this is important to them. It's interesting that they would say something like that. It's almost as if they're saying, I really wish there was some proof. And they're trying to elicit that proof from someone else. And so, by all means, we should accommodate them and point out, it seems that you're interested in proof for God. What would you find acceptable as evidence that God exists? If I were to say, if you say there is no proof, what would be acceptable proof? Where you could then say, there is a God, there is proof. And maybe we can look for some proof that we might be able to help them to see. Any questions about that? So the second example, I was listening to an NPR broadcast with Cyndi Lauper. I think it was on NPR. I think I had that same dilemma during my last session, trying to remember where I heard it, but I'm pretty sure it was on NPR. Anyhow, she is being asked by somebody here about LGBT kids, that is lesbian, gay, bi, and transgendered. And she says up to 40% of the young people are homeless in this country are LGBT, and the reason I was so concerned is because only 3 to 5% of the general youth population identify as gay or transgender, which means they're getting thrown out. And the interviewer says, thrown out of their houses? Lauper, thrown out of their houses, thrown out of every place, just because they're gay or transgender. That is like throwing your child out because he has brown hair or she has brown hair. Wow. Lots of things going on here that we could certainly address with Cyndi Lauper. I might begin by asking, how does she know they're being thrown out? What might be transpiring that's causing them to be thrown out? I mean, are there none of these children are leaving the home for other reasons? Are they actually all leaving home? I think this is, first off, an estimate of the number of homeless kids, so we have that issue. Lauper adds, they're thrown out of every place. That seems a little broad. I mean, really? They're being thrown out of every place? So they can't go into any store. They can't go to the grocery store, the gas station. They can't go to bathrooms. They just have to be outside 24/7 because they're being thrown out of every place. Clearly, that's absurd. I mean, I realize I'm being absurd in that, but that's the point. The statement that she made is absurd, and I think it's helpful to point out that's absurd, but not to say, well, Cyndi Lauper, that's absurd. But maybe to say, are they being thrown out of everything? I mean, they can't even go to the bathroom inside, and get them to concede that what they're saying actually isn't true. that what she just said was not a true statement, and that she needs to backpedal on her claim and go back to the claim where it really belongs, and that is maybe some of them are being thrown out, and there are some places they get thrown out. What are those places? Why are they being thrown out of those places? And we can then have a more rational conversation about it. And then her statement, that's like throwing your child out because he has brown hair or she has brown hair. What in the world does that have to do with anything? I just don't know what the relationship is between the connection between being gay and transgendered and being thrown out for that, or being thrown out because you have brown hair or not brown hair. I might pick away at that a little bit. I'd certainly be picking at the thrown out of their houses and out of every place just because they're gay. It's interesting that Cyndi Lauper is well versed in this and knows that every single child that gets thrown out of their house that's gay is being thrown out just because they're gay. You might want to ask her about that. Try to elicit some responses. Are they all being thrown out just because they're gay? Might there be other reasons why they might be thrown out? If they're being thrown out, is it possible that some of the children who are no longer in their homes actually weren't thrown out at all? That they ran away from home because they didn't want to be under the authority of their parents? Is that a possibility? At which point, I think Ms. Lauper would find herself having to concede some of her ground, in which case we will be able to have a more rational discussion about it. The last one that I'll revisit from the last session is the Chick-fil-A issue, when Chick-fil-A President Dan Cathy had created a monster furor over gay and lesbian issues by saying that, what did he do? Believes that company invests its earnings to advance its values. Chick-fil-A believes that loving, committed gay and lesbian couples, including those raising children, should not be entitled to the dignity, respect, protections that come with marriage. The company is using its dollars to shape public and political discourse by funding organizations that promote homophobia in the U.S. and abroad. Now, this is an article that came out of the USA Today relating to the issue that was going on. And clearly there's some issues. This is a two-slide article. It was a fairly long segment that I had cut out, but clearly there's some things in here that we could start having some issues with. In particular, the fact that the news writer, as they were writing here, clearly has a bias. Now, there's nothing wrong with having a bias. We all have biases. And this writer clearly has a bias. The company is using its dollars to shape public and political discourse by funding organizations that promote homophobia. Now, I don't know. I don't recall anything going on that Chick-fil-A had said that actually was fearful of homosexuals in any way. They said they believe that marriage was between a man and a woman, and they fund organizations that support that. And I don't hear homophobia in that. And so now it's an issue of we are using some language in this letter that is intended to be inflammatory. And we really have to watch our guard, because that happens a lot. We do that in our own arguments in an attempt to persuade and to convince people to use language that could be perceived as inflammatory or a little stronger than really is warranted from the evidence that we have. And so that's a very inflammatory statement. I would want to write to the editor in regard to something like that. The rest of the article doesn't really get much better. We urge mall owners who rent space to Chick-fil-A to look deeply at the hateful organizations the company supports. We ask university officials to consider accommodating a business that ostracizes a large segment of their student body. there was nothing in what Dan Cathy said that students who were gay and lesbian weren't welcome in Chick-fil-A stores. In fact, people who are gay and lesbian eat at Chick-fil-A stores quite frequently. In fact, gay and lesbians eat at many businesses that support traditional marriage, shop in stores that do, buy products from companies that do. Clearly some very inflammatory language here that I would be very cautious about and start asking some questions about what's going on here. And when someone were to say to me, these hateful organizations, I might ask, so what kind of hateful things are they doing? How would you define a hateful organization? Not being rude. I don't understand what that means when you use that word. I use it a different way. And so I'd like to know what you mean by that so that at least I understand where you're coming from. When we say it that way, now we've opened the door that this is a dialogue. I'm not shutting you down. I don't think you're a moron just because you said hateful. I actually want to understand what you mean by that. But then it allows me, once I have an understanding, to be able to have a more rational discussion with them and actually be able to present them information and evidence that says, no, they're not hateful. Your definition of hateful either doesn't line up with what hateful really means, or if what you say is hateful and they don't do that, then they're not hateful. So we have two possible avenues that we could take that. Any questions? Anybody? Anybody? Okay. So, the tough questions. Now, my main questions that I wanted to talk about, we've already touched a little bit upon one of them, and that was homosexuality. And we're going to talk about two tonight, and that is homosexual marriage and abortion. And I'll spend most of my time talking about abortion and not homosexual marriage, but I will talk about homosexual marriage a little bit. So quite often we hear a question like, what harm is there allowing people in love to get married? And okay, so we want to be able to answer something like this, or to be able to address something like this. And I think it's helpful to start asking some questions. Again, that is the first step, is to take the approach of the Kunbo approach, and that is start asking questions. Start trying to find out what they mean. What do you mean by married? Who gets to define what marriage is? It's quite clear that marriage has been around for a long time, so somewhere, somehow, marriage got defined a particular way. Who defined it? Is that a cultural definition of marriage, or is there a higher power that defines it? Interestingly enough, in the Supreme Court of Minnesota, Baker versus Nelson, October 15th, 1971, they defined it: the institution of marriage as a union of man and woman, uniquely involving the procreation and rearing of children within a family, is as old as the book of Genesis. Supreme Court of Minnesota. So the highest court in the state of Minnesota says it was between a man and a woman, and that it went all the way back to the beginning in the book of Genesis. That's sort of interesting. Remember that whole separation of church and state thing. But here we have a state-sanctioned organization who is telling us that marriage is defined in Genesis. It's pretty interesting. So it helps to find out what we mean by marriage and who actually gets to define marriage. If marriage can be defined by culture, then there's really no reason to even have a discussion. Marriage is meaningless because the culture defines it anyways. It can be anything we want it to be. And therefore, why are we having this discussion? Why is someone else worried about what marriage is if marriage is culturally defined anyways? But marriage isn't culturally defined. Not in that sense. Marriage has been defined from the very beginning. But of course we understand that because we read the book of Genesis, and we read in chapter 2 when God tells us that a man and a woman are to be united as one. Um, that is marriage. Nowhere in the Scripture does it tell us that marriage is to be any other way. Of course, some people may argue, well, Jacob had a lot of wives, David had a lot of wives. Does that mean marriage can involve more than one woman? Seemed to be. That seems to be a big issue. David was a man after God's own heart, a pillar in the faith, and yet he had multiple wives. But just because the Bible says that somebody did something doesn't mean that the Bible sanctions what they did. In fact, sometimes the Bible kills the people for doing those things, and sometimes the Bible uses them. Well, not the Bible, but God uses those people who are mentioned in the Bible, even in the evil acts that they're doing. He will use those things, but it does not mean he sanctions those. He defined marriage, and Jesus reiterated that in Matthew. Reiterated that marriage was between a man and a woman, and not anyone else. In fact, the Bible makes it very clear in both Leviticus and in Romans that homosexuality is abhorrent to God and not right. And therefore, from the Christian perspective, marriage is only between man and woman. That's the only way it ever should be. But getting back to this particular question, what harm is there in allowing people in love to get married? Once we try to answer the question of what is marriage, we might need to answer the question, what's the purpose of marriage? Maybe that'll help us define what marriage really is. What is the purpose of marriage? I think it's long been understood that the purpose of marriage is to procreate. That is what God told Adam and Eve. You are to go forth and multiply and fill the earth. That is not possible in a homosexual marriage. It's also a more safe, stable environment for children to be raised in. In fact, it's the perfect, safe, stable environment. It allows children, which research has shown, to be raised by both a father and a mother in an optimal situation, which children need in order to be raised properly. Does that mean that there are marriages, that all marriages are like that? No, it doesn't mean that at all. Unfortunately, we live in a broken, fallen world, and not all marriages are like that. But God set forth a standard that this is what marriage is supposed to do. It's the same as we look at what Jesus told us is the standard for our very lives. We are to be perfect as He is perfect. Is that possible? Am I perfect? Are you perfect? Nobody can claim to be perfect. The only person that's ever walked this earth that's been perfect was Jesus Christ. And so it's not possible for us to actually be that way. And I would dare say it's not possible for marriage to ever truly be what it's supposed to be if both of the people involved are imperfect beings to begin with. And so marriage is never going to reach that standard that it's striving to reach. So should we just throw the standard out? It doesn't seem like that makes any sense. Why throw a standard out because I can't ever reach it? I can get closer to it. I can always make steps towards that perfection and towards that standard. And so I think it's important that we continue to strive and to encourage people to actually support marriage in its proper context. I would say here there seems to be an underlying notion in this statement. What harm is there allowing people in love to get married? When you ask, what harm is there? So what I think this person is asking, and I might ask them, when you talk about what kind of harm do you think we're doing? What harm is there to stop them from being married? What harm am I doing to a homosexual, telling them that they can't get married? And try to elicit that from them. Oftentimes they'll say they're being discriminated against, they're being treated as second-class citizens. And then I like to try to remind them that actually a homosexual has every right, like everybody else, to get married. Every person in the United States has the right to get married. You just can't marry whoever you want. There's a restriction on who you can marry. And of course, then someone will say, well, what right does the government have to restrict who I can marry? Well, I like to then ask another question. Well, are there any times when there is a right to restrict that? I mean, should a person be allowed to marry their dog? How about their child? Would that be okay? And of course the person's going to say, well, heavens no, that's absurd. And well, if it's not okay for an adult to marry their child, you have put a restriction on marriage. You're discriminating against that adult. That adult loves that child. And isn't that what you just asked? What harm is there for these two people who are in love to get married? What harm is there in letting an adult marry their child? I think anyone in their right mind would look at that and see the obvious harm in that situation and would never agree that that is something that should be allowed, if they're being honest with themselves. Now, those people who are really adhering to their beliefs, and there are some people out there that think this way, would say that it's perfectly fine, because marriage should be between two people who love each other, and that is all that matters. And it's hard to argue with someone like that who is being at least consistent with their own beliefs and not inconsistent, because most of the time, and I would say in the vast majority of times, you're going to encounter someone who is actually being inconsistent. They don't actually believe what they're claiming. They don't actually believe this statement. They only believe it in certain instances when they want to believe in this situation. I want to be allowed to do what I want to do, and you're not letting me. And therefore, I think you're discriminating against me. But then they'll turn right around and discriminate against someone else under the same belief system. It's very inconsistent. We want to be able to show them what you're saying is actually inconsistent with what you believe. And therefore, maybe something's wrong with what you believe. And we need to try to address that. And another thing that it's not a very compelling part of the argument, but certainly we can talk about a slippery slope here. If we can allow 2 men or 2 women to marry because they love each other, why couldn't we allow 3 men and 2 women, or 5 women and 6 men? What's wrong with those arrangements? Why don't we allow those? It doesn't make any sense that we don't allow these other arrangements where people all love each other. Again, going back to the adult and their child, why don't we allow that? I mean, anything that we can think of where 2 people would love each other, or as many people as necessary love each other, why aren't they allowed to get married then? You won't argue for those, you just want to argue for these. And I would like to know why your argument doesn't extend that far. And if it does, obviously the slippery slope comes in, why don't we allow adults and children to marry, and which causes many people to get very upset in what you're saying, thinking, well, what's wrong with you? Why would you suggest something like that? I'm just consistent with your beliefs here. Let's go there and let's see where that goes. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Any questions about that before I go on to abortion? I'm going to talk about abortion for a little bit. A lot of what I'm going to talk about here in the abortion area is from Scott, I think his last name is Klusendorf. The website is on the slide there, prolifetraining.com. great resources. Mr. Klusendorf has a book called Case for Life that is a well-respected book presenting some great arguments for dealing with those who would support abortion. And so we're going to cover this, but I'm going to bring in, because the information I have here dovetails very well with something else. Scott Klusendorf used to work with Stand to Reason, which is run by Greg Kokel, and so there's a number of parallel resources. They sort of work hand in hand, and I'm going to take advantage of something that Alan Schleman did called Answer Every Defense for Abortion, which I would recommend people go to Stand to Reason's website, which is str.org, and get Answer Every Defense for Abortion. It's a nice little flow chart that helps you to think about there's just the basic questions that you need to ask, and I'm going to talk about them. But go there and get the flow chart. It's a great flow chart. But that's what we're going to talk about. So suppose you have 5 minutes to graciously defend your pro-life belief with friends or classmates. Can you do it with rational arguments? What should you say? How can you simplify the abortion issue for those who think it's hopelessly complex? It's a quote straight from their first resource on 5-minute apologetics for abortion. And so if you've been paying attention, you would know what we would start with in a situation when someone says they support abortion. What would we start with? We'd start with questions. So now this resource just calls it clarify the issues. But it's the same thing as let's start with the Columbo approach. Let's start asking questions. And basically, when dealing with abortion issues, it's helpful to get at the root of what we're talking about. Are we talking about a human being? Because if we're not talking about a human being, we can kill. It makes no difference. It's not a human being. We have every right to kill it. But if it's a human being, we might have to deal with something else. So we try to get at what they believe in this issue. Of course, since we know it's a human being, and if they were to say no, well, we might have an issue with that, because we actually think that what is developing in the womb is actually a human being. And so we would take advantage of what's called the trot out the toddler. That's how Greg Kokel refers to it. Trot out the toddler. And that is, take what they are arguing and ask them if it applies to this toddler. Because what will happen is, as they're arguing for abortion and saying that this is not a human, they'll say things like, well, I'd really hate for someone who is not in good financial situation, who realizes that it's going to be a tough road, to have to bear that child. And so it'd be easier for her just to go ahead and kill the baby. So, okay, well, I've got this 2-year-old over here, and the mother just lost her job. The dad was killed the year before. They have no money. They're about to lose their house. What she would like to do, because this would make it a whole lot easier, is she'd like to kill her child. Is that okay? I would dare guess most people would look at that and think, oh my gosh, what are you, nuts? That's not okay. Nobody would think that would be okay. Well, I can't say nobody. There are some people that probably think it's okay. I think the vast majority of honest people will look at that situation and say, no, it's not okay to kill that child. Why is it not okay? It's the same, it's the same thing. She's not going to be able to take care of this child. Why won't you let her kill this child? But you'll let her kill the unborn child that she's yet to bear. It helps to show some inconsistencies with what they believe. But the next thing I'd ask is, I would like to go all the way back into the hospital room where the baby was born, and maybe get a little closer to this issue of whether this is a human being or not. So you're telling me that the child in the womb that you don't believe is a human being at one moment could be killed, and 1 second later, once it comes out of the womb, that now is a human being and can no longer be killed. That it became a human being by coming out of the womb. And of course, there might be some struggle there and some awkwardness as they try to figure out how to deal with that dilemma. That all it is a matter of place. And that's a little bit of an issue. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in our next one, because there are definitely some things about this that are interesting. So another argument that people say is women have the right to make their own private decisions. You know, what goes on in the bedroom is their business and nobody else's. What right do you have to tell a woman what to do in her home? And then, again, I would trot out that toddler. And I'd say, so if I killed my child at home, I won't let you in so you can't see it. It's the privacy of my home. Is that okay? Can I kill my aged mother because she's not doing very well? I'll do it at home. I won't let anybody know. Is that okay? Or should the government arrest me for murder? Maybe not do it so snarky, but try to elicit that. So what you're saying is it would be okay to kill my mother in the privacy of my own home. And I don't know that that's actually true. I don't think that you would actually agree to that. If they were to say yes, what's in the womb is actually a human being. Oh, now we've got to start asking some more questions. Oh, you do believe that's a human being now? Okay. So we might want to get at, are all human beings valuable? You're distinguishing between human beings in the womb and human beings not in the womb. And the ones that are not in the womb seem to be more valuable than the ones that are in the womb. And that's an interesting statement. And so, if they believe that, if they don't believe that all human beings are actually of the same value, then we can start talking about location and size and those kind of things. And what we use is called the sled defense. The sled defense, I think this actually came from when Scott was working at Stand to Reason, but anyhow, they both use this defense. Basically, SLED is size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. Because all of these things come to play when someone is saying there's a difference between the human being in the womb and the one that's not. One, the human being in the womb is a different size. Remember, thinking all the way back to the tiny little embryo as it's developing, very small and insignificant. Someone would like to think that that there's a difference between that child and the one that is 2 feet tall who's standing in front of you. But if they think there's a difference between those two, then I would say, why don't we kill that one? Because that 2-foot child is way smaller than I am. And for that matter, they could kill me because I'm not near as big as, I don't know, pick your favorite basketball player. They're all way bigger than I am, I know that. Size is not really an important matter here. We're all made of the same genetic material. That child, once that egg and sperm unite, begins a human life. That child has DNA. Within a few weeks, that child has a heartbeat. They actually have a heart that's beating within weeks. And we're saying there's a distinction between that child and the one that's outside the womb. And it doesn't make any sense. So we can start looking at that. Level of development, again, they can try to argue that it's okay to kill an embryo, a developing child, because it's not developed at that point, even before the heart starts beating. There's no heart there. It's developing at that time. So it's okay to start killing that child then. Well, gosh, again, we can in all these situations, we can track that toddler back out again. Because that toddler, that 2-year-old that we have, is that 2-year-old fully developed? Their frontal lobe's not developed until they're in their 20s. So I should be able to kill every teenager on this planet. And I know many parents have this urge. We cannot kill them. Because we realize they're human beings. They are not fully developed. So the level of development that they have here can't be relevant. If it's relevant, then we should be able to kill anybody that actually hasn't fully developed yet. That would be anybody, basically, unless you're an adult. And even some adults aren't fully developed. Some adults, though they may be of adult age, still have developing brains and maybe mentally handicapped that have that have slowed the development in their bodies. This argument of development can be used to kill anybody, and that doesn't hold water. I cannot kill a 2-year-old because they are not fully developed. Therefore, now remember, we're talking about someone who actually agrees that what's in the womb is actually a human being. And so we can take this and extrapolate it back. This is not a fully developed human being in the womb. It's not a fully developed human being when they're 2. They're not fully developed human beings when they're 12. We can't kill any of them. And I think we want to try to make it very clear to them that all of those are human beings. What makes us be able to kill one and not the other? And if we can't kill one, we can't kill the other. The next one is environment. Again, going back to that discussion we had earlier. What's the difference between whether they're in the womb or not? That seems to be interesting. One of the things that they point out in their arguments that they present is position. Is their position in the womb, and as they travel down the birth canal and are birthed, why that short distance really makes a difference. And the question would be, is there a difference between whether you sleep on your left side and on your right? Does your value change because of that? I don't think so. Does your value change if you're on one side of the street versus the other? I don't think so. And so why does it make a difference whether they're in the womb or not? I think that's an important question to try to get at. I don't think changing location really warrants the killing of a child. And the last one is the degree of dependency. If a child in the womb is so dependent on their mother to survive, we should be able to kill it. That child cannot survive without its mother. Again, try out that toddler. The 2-year-old cannot survive without its mother either. And we cannot kill a 2-year-old. And so we cannot rely on viability as a determination of whether we can kill a person or not. Someone who is on insulin to survive is dependent on something. They are not viable without insulin. So can we kill them? I don't think we can. So that's the sled defense. And now if they were to say, yes, all human beings are valuable, then we can take the roof off, as Greg Koppel says. And that's basically that what they're arguing is absurd. They think all humans are valuable, and yet still they believe it is okay to kill a child. And that clearly is not a rational argument in any way, and we want to point that out. We really want to challenge our, as Scott Klusendorf says, challenge our audience to be intellectually honest, intellectually honest in their arguments, and this does not seem to be intellectually honest. You think that they are valuable human beings, and you still think it's okay to kill them? That doesn't really seem to hold water. And so you're saying that a woman's right to choose actually trumps her child's right, and that doesn't seem to be a very rational argument. So any questions about that? All right, so what's next? That is the end of part 3, so we got nothing left. We're done, right? Wrong. We need to practice, practice, practice. In order for us to be able to perform apologetics, to practice apologetics in our lives, we need to seek opportunities where we can defend ourselves, that we can defend our faith, that we can defend our beliefs, whether it be through letters to the editor, whether it be through phone calls to radio stations, whether it be conversations on the street. Whatever it is, we need to be able to defend that. And the only way that we can do this and do this well is to practice. And so, while I would love it if you would, watch the videos again and learn some things from that, I think there are better resources out there than my videos. As I pointed out over and over again in my presentations, as shown here, I have a number of resources that I think are very valuable, very helpful, and added a few more to this one. I would highly recommend Greg Kogle's book, Tactics, and also I personally like The Ultimate Proof of Creation. Both books are great books. I think everyone should have a copy in their library at home. So, any questions? I thank you all for coming. I pray that you will be able to use some of the things that you learned in this, and that you will be able to go out and make better arguments and be able to help others to see the truth and to see more clearly where their thinking is flawed, and help them to help lead them to Christ through those discussions, because that is ultimately what we desire. Thank you very much. Have a great night.